In this video, we're going to explore Datastar and Django together and build a small application. So we did an intro video on Datastar where we explored the basics of the framework. I'll leave a link to it below the video, but in a nutshell, it brings the functionality of Alpine.js and HTMX together into one cohesive solution. And a lot of people were requesting that follow-up video with Django. So we're going to look at that in this video, and we're going to look at the Python SDK for Datastar. So let's get right into it, but before we do, if you want to support the channel, check out the Ko-fi page we have just below the video, and we've also opened channel memberships. And we're going to do a poll for members in the next few days to explore some topics you'd like to see on the channel in the near future. So let's get into this video. I'm going to leave a link to this GitHub repo underneath the video, and this contains some starter code. And it's a basic Django project, and we're going to open that now in VS Code. And notice here at the bottom, we're using Python version 3.13 in this video. I would recommend using the latest version if possible. And we're going to be building a small film application, but more on that in a second. Let's go back to the Datastar documentation. Now at the top here, I'm going to go to the reference section, and we're going to look at the SDKs section. Now we saw in the last video the client-side package that Datastar uses on the browser, but there are backend SDKs available in different programming languages. For example, C#, Go, and so on. In this video, we're going to use the Python SDK, and this includes support for a bunch of different Python backends. Now let's go to this GitHub page and have a quick look here on this SDK. So it's called datastar-py, and it provides these backend helpers for Datastar. Now the key point here is that Datastar requires all backend responses to use server-sent events, and this Python package is going to help you with the formatting of these responses, and it's going to provide helper functions for the different supported responses as well. We're going to see examples in this video. Now let's get back to VS Code and let's have a quick introduction to this project. I'm going to clear the terminal at the bottom. Now if you've cloned this, what you need to do basically is install Django into a Python virtual environment. That's the only requirement from the starter code. And once you've done that, you can run the migrate command, and that's going to create the database on the left-hand side, which is a local SQLite database. And then we have a helper script here. Now let's explain this. Let's go to models.py. We have a single model in this application in the starter code, and it's modeling film data. Now inside management/commands, we also have a script here called generate films, and this is going to automatically generate some films for this video. So now that we've run the migrations, we can run python manage.py and it's generate films, and that's going to add those films to the database, and we have 15 created at the end of that. And once that's done, we can run the Django server, and let's have a look at the single page that we have in this application. If we go to urls.py, it's at the /films route. So let's open up the browser, and if we go to that page, you can see the film collection here. This is a table containing the films that have been added to the database, and all films in the database are currently being fetched here, as you can see on line 7. We're calling film.objects.all, adding that to the context, and returning index.html. And the styling for this, if we go to the templates directory and go to base.html, this is using Tailwind CSS and Daisy UI. So let's have a quick look at index.html. You can see, for example, that we have a table here, and it's using the table class from Daisy UI, which is a component class, along with some other styles here as well. That's not important, that's all in the starter code, and we're going to work from this base. Now we have 15 films at the moment, but imagine we had 15,000 films in the database. Dumping all of those on this page is not going to be a good user experience. So we're going to implement the click to load pattern in order to deal with this. Now the benefit of click to load is that we can show the first n number of films, and we can have a button just below the table that allows the user to then click and get the next set of films. And after we get the next set, the user will then click another button if they want to, and that can continue indefinitely until the user gets fed up searching for films, or we reach the end of the list of films. Now this is an example of something called progressive disclosure, and that's where information is revealed gradually, and that prevents cognitive overload. So when you're dealing with large amounts of data, you want to progressively disclose that data to the user to avoid letting them get overwhelmed by the amount of data on the screen. And it also gives the user control. They can search for more films if they want to, but they can stop to if, for example, they find what they need. And of course, there's also a performance benefit potentially. And that's because getting 15,000 films out of the database and then dumping them onto a web page, that is not going to be performant, and the DOM is going to become bloated. Now you might have seen this pattern on social media, and of course infinite scroll is a similar pattern. Let's go back to the Datastar documentation and go to the examples page, and it's similar to this click to load pattern they have here. So we have a table on the page, we click a button, and we can load more data. So let's get started building this with Datastar and go back to our application. Now we're going to use Django's pagination utilities for this, so let's go to VS Code and let's go to views.py. Now at the top from django.core.paginator we can import this object here called paginator, and then we can pass the films to a paginator object as we're about to see. So let's create that object just now. It's going to be called paginator, and that should be lowercase here. So we're going to instantiate the object and we pass the query set of all of the films into that, along with a number per page, and I'm going to set that to 5. And we can also fetch a page number from the URL, so let's do that just now using request.get. That is a dictionary, so we can call .get to get a page query parameter, and we can set a default of page 1. And the final thing to do here is get a page object. We can take our paginator that we instantiated, and we can call the getPage function and pass in the page number that we're actually getting here. So those 3 lines of code instantiate a paginator object, and we get 5 films from the database based on the page number that we pass into this function. And when we have a page object, what we can do is essentially add that to the context. So let's replace the films that we had before, and I'm going to change this name here to film_page just to closer reflect what it actually is. And then we have access to the film page inside index.html, which is the Django template that we're rendering here. So let's go to that template, and we're going to replace this for loop here. We have renamed the context variable to film page. We can iterate over that to get the films that were retrieved from that page number. And under the hood, this paginator class here is going to perform some limit and offset magic using SQL, but we don't need to worry about that. Let's just go back to the application, and this time if we refresh the page, notice we only get 5 films returned from the database on this occasion. So that's brilliant, but we can't actually fetch the other films at the moment, so we're going to need to add a button below this. So let's go back to the template, and what we're going to do underneath the table that we have here is we're going to define a button. So I'm going to paste some code in here. So we have a button with an ID, and notice these classes, these are coming from Daisy UI. So we have the button component class, we have button primary, which is a modifier that gives it the primary color in the color scheme, and we also add some margin top to separate it from the table above. So we've added that. Let's get back to the application and refresh this page, and notice we see the load more button appearing at the bottom. And at this point we're ready to start bringing Datastar into the equation. So what we want to happen here essentially when we click this button is we want to send a request to Django, and that request should fetch the next 5 films that we have and return them and add them to this table. So we want to return a hypermedia response that Datastar can then utilize and swap those new films into this existing table. And this is going to introduce some new stuff that we did not see in the previous video, because this is going to introduce the server SDKs, and we're going to see how to wire that up, in this case with Python. Now to start with, we're going to need to install the Python SDK for Datastar, so let's copy the name of that package, and we can go back to VS Code, and on the terminal inside the Python virtual environment, let's run pip install, and we'll install datastar-py. Now I've already installed it, but that's going to install it into your Python virtual environment, and let's go back to views.py. And I want to import something from datastar-py now, so let's do that. From datastar-py.django, we're going to import a class called datastar-response. So datastar-response is a class that's defined, and ultimately when we click this button here in the user interface, it's going to send the request to Django, and the Django view is going to return this response. Now there's not a lot of documentation on this at the moment, so I want to open up the source code for this datastar-py package. And if we look at datastar-py, you can see there are different modules here, for example for Django, for FastAPI, for FastHTML, and so on. And if we open django.py, we can look at some of the code. Now notice the datastar response is a subclass of Django's StreamingHttpResponse. If we scroll up here, that's been imported from django.http. So we're returning a subclass of StreamingHttpResponse, and we're going to cover a little bit more what that means later in the video. For now, let's move on. I just wanted to introduce this package and import this response because ultimately that's what we're going to return from this view when Datastar sends a request. Now, of course, we also need to add Datastar to the project inside the base template. So let's go to base.html. And we saw in the last video how to install Datastar from a CDN. So let's do that again just now. And we're going to paste that link into the head tag of the document. So at this stage, we can close base.html and we're going to look at this button now. This is the button responsible for loading more films from the back end. And what we're going to need to do here, if we go back to the documentation again, let's go to the reference section and let's go to these action plugins. These are used in Datastar expressions to perform specific actions. And we have actions here for the HTTP methods. For example, this one is the GET action that's going to send a GET request to our Django backend. Under the hood, this uses the fetch API, and it handles merging the response with the current DOM and also signals that are defined. Now what we're going to do is we're going to add this data on click to our button here. So let's copy this, and I'm going to go back to the button that we have. And we're going to change the URL, of course, but let's paste that in for now. So on the button click event, what we're going to do is send the GET request. And we're going to change this to the URL that we have in our application, and that is the /films URL. Now at the bottom, let's start the server, and we're going to test this out when we click the button and see if a request is being sent. So let's go back to our application and refresh this page. I'm going to open the browser network tab. And if we click the load more button, notice that that is sending a request to the backend, as you can see here. So it's localhost 8000/films, and it's adding a Datastar query parameter to the URL. Now there's one other thing I want to note here in the request headers section. If we scroll down, notice the Datastar request header is set to true. That is going to be added automatically when Datastar initiates a request to the backend. So if you're familiar with HTMX, it's very similar to the HX request HTTP header. So let's close that and go back to the template. What we can also do is add a query parameter here. So I'm going to add one for the page. And let's say we want to fetch the next page here. What we can do is we can take the page object, which was called film_page. And just to refresh our memories, that's what we had in the context here. And that was the page object we got back from the paginator. Now the page object has a function we can call here, and it's called next page number. And in Django templates, we don't actually need to call that. We can just reference the attribute here. And what that's going to do is add the page number to the URL. So let's save this again. And if we go back to our application, let's go back to the network tab one more time. When we click load more, notice this time it's added page and set that to 2 here in the query parameters. So by default, the page is 1. When we click that, the page is incremented to 2. We're actually going to get rid of this page from the URL later in the video, but let's leave it for now. Now the question is, what do we actually do on the back end? So let's go to views.py. And after we set this context up here, I'm going to perform a check at the moment. So we're going to check for datastar-request, and let me try and spell request correctly here. We're going to check for that in the request.headers property of the Django request object. And that is going to tell us basically whether or not the request originates from Datastar. And if it does, let's just print hi from Datastar for now. And we can save that. And again, this is very similar to HX request. Let's now go back to the page here. When we refresh this page, we can then click the button, and if we go back to our application that's running on VS Code, notice on the terminal we do get that print. So we now know that we can pick up that the request is from Datastar on the back end, but what do we actually want to return here? So essentially we want the next set of table rows that can be swapped into this table body, and the new rows are going to contain the next set of films that have been fetched from the database by Django and by this paginator object. So there's a couple of things we need to do here. I want to take the existing table rows, and I want to move these into their own dedicated partial or template fragment in Django. So let's go back to VS Code and go to index.py, and actually that's index.html. And what we want to do here is we want to go to the table body, and we want to look at this for loop. So we're essentially going to copy all of the contents of this for loop. So it's the table row for each film that we have coming back from Django. And we also want the line above it with the actual for loop expression. And let's cut this out of here for now, and let's go to the sidebar, and we're going to define a partials subfolder here inside the templates folder, and inside that we can define table-rows.html. And we're going to paste this code in here, and let me fix the indentation. And don't forget to end the for loop at the bottom. So that's the end for statement in Django. So we have a for loop now in table-rows.html, and for each film that we have in the context, we're rendering out a row in the table, and that's what we actually see here. So each row is represented by one of those. Now we need to fix the parent template here, so let's go back to index.html. We now have this empty block just hanging around, and we also need to include the table rows partial that we've extracted when the page first loads. So let's create an if statement here. If we do have a film page in the context, what we can do in that case is we can use Django's include template tag, and our new partial is in the partials directory, and it's table-rows.html, and you will understand more why we've extracted this to a partial a little bit later in the video. Now if we don't have any films, we want to delegate back to what we had before, which is the table row here, telling the user that no films were found. And one last thing we need to do is change this end for, because it's now an if statement, so we can use the end if expression. So all we're doing here is just restructuring things a little bit to work better with this hypermedia model. And we've extracted this into a partial template One last thing I want to do is give the table body an ID, because we are going to refer to that table body on the back end when we return our Datastar response. So let's just give it an ID of movie table body. Now before we move on, let's just verify that this is still loading all of this when the page first loads. So that's before we include Datastar anywhere. Everything is still working, and the film rows that we see inside the table body are now being rendered by this partial. Now on the server, when we get the request after clicking this button, we want to return a Datastar enabled response, and that's going to be inside this block of code here. Now I have to say the documentation on this is not the most comprehensive at the moment, but let's go to the documentation anyway, and we're going to go back to the reference page. So on this page here, we're going to see some of the server sent events functions, or event types rather. And we're going to use 3 of these in this video. So for example, Datastar merge fragments is going to merge HTML fragments that you send back from Django into the DOM. We will look at that. We're also going to look at Datastar merge signals, and that's going to update the signal values on the client side with new values coming from the server. And finally, we're also going to look at Datastar remove fragments, and that can remove HTML from the DOM. Now let's start with this merge fragments one. This is the one we need at the moment. And what we send into this is a fragment of HTML content, and that's the content we actually want to render on the front end. We also send a selector, and that is going to select the target element of the merge process. So that's similar to hx_target in HTMX. And we also have a merge mode, which is similar to the hx_swap attribute in HTMX. For example, we can do inner HTML, outer HTML, and so on. So we're going to use this right now, and let's go back to VS Code, and let's build this block of code up gradually. I'm going to go to the top here, and we're going to bring in an import, and that's going to be from django.template.loader, and it's the render to string function that loads a template and then renders it with a context into a string. So let's copy the name of this and go back down to our if statement. I'm going to remove the print statement. And what we're going to do here is define an inner function that I'm going to call DatastarResponse. And this function is what we're going to pass to the Datastar response, as we'll see in a second. So let's start by getting the HTML we want to send back over the wire. And we're going to call the render to string function. The first parameter to that is the template name. And it's going to be that partial template that we defined called tablerows.html. And we also need to define a context. So we can take the context that we've already got up here and we can pass that in. And we are going to go over this later on again once we've finished the example. Now once we've got the HTML, we want to generate this Datastar merge fragments event type. So let's see how to do that. Again, we're going to import something from datastar-py, and that's going to be something called server sent event generator, and I'm going to import that as SSE. So we can take that and go back down to our function. And what we're going to do is actually yield sse.merge fragments. So this is the merge fragments event type, and we pass some data into that. For example, the fragments is going to be the HTML content, and we've already generated that on the line above. So let's start with that one. Fragments is going to be set to HTML. We also want a merge mode, and we saw that that was akin to hx_swap in HTMX. Now to get the merge mode, what I'm going to do is bring in one more import at the top. So let's go back to the top here, and from datastar-py, we're going to import a constants module, and we can refer to different merge types here. So let's use consts, and we're going to look at fragment merge mode, and it's going to be a particular merge type that we're going to use called append. And the last thing we need to do is set a selector here. And the selector is going to be the table body, and this ID that we defined, we can target that here using the selector. So it's the hash movie table body to refer to that ID. And don't worry at the moment if this doesn't make a lot of sense. We are going to cover this as we progress through the example. And then the final thing we need to do here inside this particular block is we need to return the Datastar response. And we're going to pass the content into that by referring to that Datastar response function that we just defined, which is this one here. So basically, if we get a Datastar request, we're going to return this response, and the content is going to be defined by this function here. And what this function is doing is yielding this merge fragments event type. And that's going to result in that server sent event coming back from the server to the browser. And it's going to have this HTML content, and we're going to merge it into this target here using the append mode. So basically what that means is that the target is this table body. And if we append the content coming back to that table body, what that hopefully is going to do on our application is it's going to add the new rows after this last row that we have here. And that will effectively define our click to load pattern. So let's actually try this out and refresh the page. And when we click this button, notice that it is working. We're getting back the new content from the server, and that's the second page of data. But we are not incrementing the page anywhere, so every time we click this button, we're actually getting the same 5 films coming back from the server. And the reason that this is happening is because in views.py, every time that request comes from Datastar, the page number that we have here is going to be set to 2. And if we look at the terminal for the requests that are coming in, you can see that every page number is 2. And that's because we're not actually incrementing that page number anywhere. And if we go to index.html and scroll down to this button, we're never actually updating the film page. So next page number is always going to refer to page 2. Now, one thing we could do is essentially redefine this button every time we get that request response to increment the page. But there's another way we can deal with this, and that's using Datastar signals. So what I'm going to do to the button is add a signal, and we're going to call this signal page. So it's going to be data signals, and the name of the signal in this case is going to be page. And we'll give that a default value of 1. And what we can now do is remove the query parameter from the URL. So we're no longer going to be using the page query parameter. Now we're going to use this signal that we're defining here on the button called page. Now if we go back to the source code for the SDK, let's have a look at what this Django module defines. One of the functions it defines is called read signals. And what this allows us to do is actually read the signal values on the server. So let's go back to views.py, and if we go to the top here, we can change these imports. I'm going to move them onto new lines. And these are from datastar-py.django. We're also going to import the read signals function, as you can see here. And once we've imported that, we can go to the index view. And let's read this underneath the page number. So I'm going to print this out. Read signals is a function, and we need to pass the request into that from Django. So let's pass the request and save this and go back to our application. So if we go back to this page here and refresh, let's go back to VS Code, and we can see that the signals is returning none. If we go back here and click the button, this time the request comes from Datastar, and that means it's going to send the signal value, and you can see the page is set to 1. So what we're actually going to do is remove this line of code. Let me just comment it out for now. The page number is going to be something we get from the signal. So instead of printing this out, let's define a variable called signals that we get by calling the read signals function. And then we can check if signals is none. And if signals is none, we know this request is not from Datastar. And that's because it's not sending those signals to the backend. So in that case, that's when the page first loads. We can set the page number to 1 in that case. Otherwise, we can actually get the data out of that signal. So the signal name here is page, and notice that read signals returns a Python dictionary. So we can get the page number here by using that signals dictionary, and we can get the page out of that. Now we're also going to increment this by 1, and don't forget the equals sign here. So the reason we're incrementing that by 1 is because if we go to index.html, the default value is 1 here. When we actually click the button on the front end, we want to fetch the next page of data. So in views.py, we're going to take the value of 1 and we're going to add 1 to that. So that will set the value to 2, and that will read the second page of data. And let's just remove this commented out line of code. So now the page number here that we're passing to the paginator.getPage method is actually going to be derived from the value of the page signal that we're passing from the front end and reading here on the back end. Now I want to just make sure this is still working before we move on. So let's refresh this page. And then when we click the button, we are fetching the next page of data. But the problem is if we fetch more here, we're still not incrementing that signal. So we are incrementing it on the back end. But again, every time the signal is sent to the server, it's going to be set to 1 because this default value is not being changed anywhere on the client. Now what we can actually do is propagate a change from the server to the client. So let's go back to views.py and go back down to this function here that defines the server sent events that we're sending back. Now it turns out there's another event we can use, and that's the sse.merge_signals event. So let's go back to the Datastar documentation and check this one out. This is going to update the signals with new values. So you can basically send a new value for a signal from the server, and that's going to update on the client. So how do we actually call this? Let's go back to VS Code. We're going to pass a dictionary of signals here. So it's going to have a key of page, and the value is going to be the page number that we have on the server, and that's the one that we actually incremented here. So what this means is that it's going to send this value for page back to the client, and it's going to update this signal name here of page, which refers to this here. So it's going to go from 1 to 2, and then the next time you click the button, it's going to go from 2 to 3, and so on. So this is an example of updating client state from the server to the client using the merge signals method. Let's try this out and go back to our application and just refresh the page one more time. So we have the films here. When we click more here, we can get the next set of films that begins with Inception and it ends with Forrest Gump. Now if we click this again, we are actually fetching a new set of films. So that is now working. And just to demonstrate the page number, if we go back here and actually print the page number that we have out, let's do that just now. When we save that and go back to our application here, when we click load more, we can do that again. And if we go back to the server, notice that we are now going from page 1 to page 2 and so on. Now, one last thing to do here is to actually stop fetching more when we've reached the end of the dataset. So currently we have 15 films in the table, but if we load more, we're actually going to get a repeat of this set of data here. And that's the one that starts with Pulp Fiction and ends with The Godfather. So let's just see that in action. So basically, when we reach the end of the dataset, we don't want this repetitive effect. We want to stop the user from fetching more films, and we want to actually remove the button from the DOM. Now again, Datastar has a server-sent event for this, and it's the remove fragments event. So let's click this. This is going to remove one or more HTML fragments that match the provided selector from the DOM. So the selector is going to be easy. If we go back to index.html, it's this button and it has this ID here. So let's go back to views.py and I'm going to remove that print statement. And let's go back down to our function here with the Datastar response. And we're going to yield one final server sent event. And that's going to use the server sent event generator. And this time it's the remove fragments. So the event type is remove fragments and we're going to pass a selector into that. And the selector is going to be this more films button. So let's refer to that ID. And we can now save this and test it out on the front end. Let's go back to the application and let's fetch more films. We get the next set of 5 films. And actually that's just removed the entire button, even though there are more films to fetch. And that's because I've actually forgotten one line of code. We don't want to remove the film button all the time. So we need to wrap this in some kind of if statement to check if there's more films to actually be fetched. So if we don't have some more data in the page, so we're going to refer to the page object, which has a method called hasNext. And if hasNext evaluates to false, you know that you've reached the end of the dataset, and only then do we want to actually remove the button. So let's try this again. Let's refresh the page. When we click the button, we get more data. And the next time we click this button, we're going to reach the end of the dataset, and you can see the button is removed. So what we're doing here is we're using the page object that we got back above here by calling the getPage method. And that page object has a method called hasNext, and that's going to be true or false. If it's true, that means there's more data to be fetched in the next page. But if it's false, it means you've reached the end of the data, and that is what we're checking for here, and that's when we remove the button. So we can essentially mutate the DOM by calling these types of methods like remove fragments as well as merge fragments. And we can also update client-side state in the signals using the merge signals event. Now I want to finish this video with a quick example of data indicator. This is an attribute that sets the value of a signal to true while the request is in flight, otherwise it's going to be false. And you can use this signal to show loading indicators and spinners and so on. So let's copy this attribute here called data indicator fetching. And let's go back to index.html, and on this button we can add this attribute. And what we're also going to do is we're going to copy this here. This is another div. We're going to paste that right underneath the button here. And we can remove the class here. So what this is essentially doing is using the data class attribute. And we saw that in the first video on Datastar. And we're setting a class of loading here conditionally depending on whether fetching is true. So fetching is only going to be true when the request is in flight. And that means when the request is in flight, we're going to have a class of loading. And that is actually a class from Daisy UI that's going to show an animation that indicates that something is loading. So let's test this out. If we save index.html, let's go back to the application and refresh the page. Now before I test this, I'm going to introduce some artificial latency to the view. So let's go back to this Django view here. And what we can do at the top here is import the time module from Python. And let's just call time.sleep for 2 seconds. Now let's save this and go back to the application and refresh the page. Notice that it's now taking 2 seconds to load. And when we click this button, notice we get the spinner appearing below, and it then fetches more content. Now obviously you can change the way that spinner looks if you don't want it to appear below the button, for example, maybe on the right hand side or even inside the button. But the idea is that you have some kind of element and it's conditionally shown when the request is in flight. And we can also use another property, for example, to disable the button when we click it. So while the request is in flight, we don't want the user to be clicking the button multiple times. We can use another property from Datastar, and that's the data_attr property. And we're going to set an attribute of disabled here conditionally, depending on this fetching signal that we defined above. Remember, fetching is true only when the request is in flight, and that means that the button here is going to be disabled only when the request is in flight. So let's see this as one final example and go back to the page. This time, when we actually get the response here, when we click the button, notice that the button is now disabled while the request is in flight. So we now have a system where we're able to fetch more content from the server, and that's using Datastar on the client side, and on the server side, if we go to views.py, we're using the server sent events and different event types like merge fragments, merge signals, and remove fragments to control those hypermedia updates and returning the Datastar response to the client. And the Datastar JavaScript package on the client side knows how to handle those responses, and it knows how to swap things into the document and update the state of the DOM accordingly. So that's just about it for this video. We now have a simple click to load application that uses Datastar. And I want to finish with one final note about performance. So let's go to the page on Django's StreamingHttpResponse class. Now this is a bit more advanced as it says here, so it's important to know how you're going to be serving your application. Will it be synchronously with the WSGI protocol or asynchronously with ASGI? So there are performance considerations when you use this. So Django with WSGI is designed for short-lived requests, but streaming responses are going to tie a worker process for the entire duration of that response, so this might result in poor performance. Now on the other hand, with ASGI, the streaming HTTP response need not stop other requests from being served while we're waiting for input and output. So with ASGI, this opens up the possibility of long-lived requests for streaming content, and also for implementing patterns like long polling and server-sent events. So that's just a note to finish the video. This might have some performance implications, and you might find some of this is more suitable with the ASGI protocol and asynchronous views in Django. So that's all for this video. Thank you for watching. I hope you found it useful. If you want to support the channel, check out our Ko-fi page. And if you want to join the channel and become a member and participate in upcoming polls about future videos, then you can find the join button just below the video. And don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't already done so. Thanks again for watching. And if you want to see more Datastar content, let me know too. And we'll see you in the next video.